In the very heart of a global superpower, during an era when the Roman Empire basked in its glory and Emperor Marcus Aurelius seemingly guided its destiny with an iron fist, an ominous threat emerged, foreshadowing profound changes. This was no military aggression, no foreign invasion. It was not barbarian hordes that caused the empire's downfall. No, the culprit behind the tragedy was something far more insidious and imperceptible. Between 165 and 180 AD, the Antonine plague, like a merciless scourge, swept through the cities and villages of the Roman Empire, sparing no one in its path. It made no distinction between common soldiers and high-ranking generals, slaves and senators. In just a few years, this deadly disease claimed the lives of 5 to 10 million people. The mighty Roman legions, once the terror of their enemies, were bled dry. Prosperous cities transformed into deserted ruins. Desperate prayers for salvation rose in the temples. Even the philosophical Emperor Marcus Aurelius, shedding tears, acknowledged, "All that is dear to our hearts will sooner or later be lost." This poignant tale of a pandemic, forgotten by many generations, became a harbinger of the Roman Empire's decline. It was this relentless disease that undermined the once unshakable might of the greatest civilization in human history. Imagine the Roman Empire at its zenith. Legions, crowned with the laurels of victory, returning from the east. Their standards proudly waving in the wind, symbolizing Rome's power and grandeur. Yet, along with their triumph, they carried a deadly threat, spreading an infection that would cause untold misery. The Antonine plague, also known as Galen's plague, appeared to the Roman Empire not merely as another illness, but as a dark vortex mercilessly tearing apart its vital organs. It received its name in honor of the ruling Antonine dynasty, yet the true origins of its emergence are shrouded behind a veil of deathbed groans and unanswered pleas. The clinical picture of the disease was particularly brutal. A rapid spike in temperature, uncontrollable diarrhea, agonizing throat inflammation, and on the 9th day, the body would be covered in pustules, as if testifying to the inevitability of a tragic end. Those who managed to survive were forever marked by the disease, while those who passed into the next world became faceless numbers, dust, and silence. Emperor Lucius Verus possibly also fell victim to this ominous scourge, sharing the fate of many of his subjects. While Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher on the throne, delved into meditations on the transience of human existence, Rome gradually lost the memory of what it meant to live when death lurked at every turn. The physicians of the time were utterly bewildered, having no idea how to stop the plague's spread. Neither wealth, nor military prowess, nor even the patronage of the Roman pantheon's gods could halt its relentless march. Only one man dared to challenge this incomprehensible force. Galen, the eminent physician of antiquity, left a detailed description of the plague, courageously fought it using all available means, and, unknowingly, left behind a legacy that survived millennia. However, for millions of Romans facing death, this meant nothing. All they felt was all-consuming uncertainty, and the pervasive smell of death that permeated every corner of their world. What price does humanity pay for epidemics? The Antonine plague, which erupted in the 2nd century AD, claimed the lives of an estimated 10% of the Roman Empire's population, amounting to approximately 7.5 million people. However, some historians believe this figure could reach a third of the entire imperial population. Imagine, men, women, children, warriors, thinkers, merchants, and slaves all fell victim to the merciless disease. At that time, the Roman Empire numbered about 75 million inhabitants. If these scales were transposed to the present day, it would mean that approximately 800 million people would vanish from the face of the earth in just a few years. Truly, a tragedy of apocalyptic proportions. Cities, with their crowded populations, poverty, unsanitary conditions, and open sewers, proved most vulnerable to the plague. Even the formidable Roman army, a symbol of power and invincibility, was brought to its knees. In some military camps, mortality rates reached 15%. The countryside, thanks to its relative isolation, suffered less, but it too did not escape a tragic fate. Dry statistics conceal personal tragedies. Behind each number lies a life cut short, an orphan child, a mother who lost her children, a lonely elder who died far from loved ones. Spontaneous burials sprang up everywhere, and temples were overflowing with worshippers whose prayers went unanswered, scattered by the wind. At the same time, there was a sharp decline in birth rates. Average life expectancy plummeted catastrophically, reaching just 20 years. In several cities, deaths began to outnumber births, forcing the empire to maintain its population through slave labor and forced resettlement. The plague destroyed not only people's physical bodies, but also gradually eroded the very foundations of the empire. Without a single shot fired, without military actions or sieges, but solely through fever, purulent wounds, and ulcers, the once powerful and ever-expanding empire began to steadily shrink in size, losing its invulnerability and former grandeur. Rome, the epicenter of ancient civilization, a hub of architectural achievements, political power, and refined culture, ironically became an ideal breeding ground for death. The problem was particularly acute in the capital, which suffered from high population density, poor sanitation, and inadequate ventilation. In the very heart of the empire, over 1 million people huddled in cramped dwellings, making do with contaminated water and stale air. Epidemics were not uncommon in the ancient world, yet none inflicted such a devastating blow as the Antonine plague. And this was possible because Rome itself had created a deadly trap for itself. In ancient Rome, despite its grandeur and power, sanitary conditions left much to be desired. Existing channels could not cope with the needs of the growing metropolis. The famous aqueducts, which supplied water, could not prevent its mixing with sewage. The influx of huge numbers of slaves after each military campaign exacerbated the situation, leading to overcrowding, poverty, and unsanitary conditions. Medicine was in its infancy, relying on superstition rather than scientific knowledge. Doctors had no idea about methods of preventing infection, and isolation of the sick was out of the question. Death lurked everywhere, and the bodies of the deceased were carried out of homes through the same doors as newborns. While the nobility preferred to retreat from the stench and suffering to their country villas, even their wealth could not protect them from the plague. The pestilence made no distinction between classes and titles. Paradoxically, the higher a person's social standing, the more vulnerable they became. The developed infrastructure, created for the prosperity of trade and military campaigns, became an ideal means for the spread of infection. The plague did not need armies or conspiracies. It merely needed Rome to live and breathe. And Rome, breathing deeply, became infected. While Rome, engulfed in flames, was tormented by unbearable heat, its borders shuddered under the onslaught of merciless foes. The plague, like an ominous shadow, sowed death not only among the common folk, peasants, merchants, and senators, but also mercilessly devoured the army, the empire's vital force. The Roman legions, models of discipline and might, whose invincibility was legendary, began to crumble one by one, defeated not on the battlefield, but within their barracks. Warriors, weakened by bloody coughs, with bodies covered in ominous black blisters, suffering from vomiting and fever, passed away. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the distinguished Stoic philosopher, found himself facing a cruel dilemma. Repelling enemy attacks on the borders of the Rhine and Danube required seasoned warriors, but his subjects were dying before they could even draw a sword. The Marcomannic War, marked by the invasion of Germanic tribes into the northern territories, turned into an unequal struggle. Rome had no healthy reserves left to defend itself. Slaves, peasants, and even criminals were conscripted into the army. Many were handed weapons without proper training, without reliable armor, without the slightest hope of victory. The ranks were filled with desperate people, and the standards of the legions, once symbolizing order and the empire's grandeur, began to droop, foreboding the collapse of civilization. Despite this, Marcus Aurelius did not lose heart. He continued to bear the burden of governing the empire, recording in his writings the thoughts of a man desperately trying to maintain sanity amidst universal chaos. However, neither profound philosophical reflections nor personal courage could halt the impending catastrophe. The most powerful military organization of the ancient world gradually fell into decline, afflicted by an invisible disease that recognized no state borders and showed no mercy. The Roman Empire continued to exist, but its foundations were severely undermined. Military actions were not fought on external frontiers, but within the empire itself, in the lungs of soldiers, in the agonizing cough that ended lives, in deserted military camps where an invisible but deadly enemy sowed death. When religious rites proved useless, and the gods remained silent before temples overflowing with bodies, Rome turned to its last hope, science, or rather, what was considered science at the time. It was then that Galen appeared, the outstanding physician of his era, who was urgently summoned to the capital by emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. He was born in Pergamon, a Greek city where sacred temples coexisted with libraries. His unique approach combined deep anatomical knowledge, philosophical logic, and genuine human compassion. Even the distinguished Galen, whose works and anatomical studies seemed comprehensive, encountered an unknown disease against which there were neither remedies nor explanations. He meticulously observed, made notes, compared symptoms, and identified a clear sequence: fever, throat inflammation, agonizing diarrhea, and then, on the 9th day, a characteristic rash with pustules. Some believe it was smallpox, others lean towards measles. But in those times, it was simply death, appearing in various guises. Galen demonstrated a courage that few physicians of his era dared to show. He isolated the sick from the healthy, insisted on hand hygiene, and urged basic isolation measures. Today these measures seem self-evident, but for Roman society, it was a true revolution in thinking. And yet, he realized that his efforts were but a minor attempt to stem the impending catastrophe. Medical knowledge was scarce, prejudices were strong, and resources limited. Nevertheless, his legacy stood the test of time. His works outlived the Roman Empire, and for over 1,000 years, Europe continued to study medicine based on his writings. The plague spared no one, but Galen remained in history as a faint light in the darkness, capturing the horrors of the disease with the pen of a man who understood that knowledge, even if it does not bring healing, is the first step towards hope. The epidemic, known as the Antonine plague, left behind horrific consequences far beyond a simple count of victims. City streets were strewn with bodies, census records showed gaping voids, agricultural lands lay fallow, craft workshops ceased their activity, and established trade routes were torn to shreds. According to widely accepted estimates, this catastrophe claimed the lives of approximately 7.5 million people, constituting about 10% of the Roman Empire's total population. However, as it turned out, this was merely a prelude to greater misfortunes. In densely populated urban centers, where poverty and unsanitary conditions were common, mortality rates soared to 15%. The empire's armed forces suffered even heavier losses, severely undermining its defensive capabilities. In rural areas, thanks to relative isolation, the plague's impact was somewhat mitigated, but this proved insufficient to prevent the destabilization of the empire's entire structure. Rome, whose population at its peak reached 75 million, never fully recovered from this blow. The combination of factors such as declining birth rates, high infant mortality, and disrupted trade routes created a truly devastating situation. Furthermore, the forced migration of slaves, brought in as a result of numerous military campaigns, many of whom suffered from various diseases or had weakened immunity, only exacerbated the already dire situation. The city of Rome, once a thriving metropolis with over 1 million inhabitants, gradually began to sink into decline and disrepair, facing an acute shortage of an able-bodied population capable of sustaining its existence. A lurking decline insidiously undermined the Roman Empire, remaining almost unnoticed amidst the daily hustle, yet sowing destructive consequences for decades to come. It was as if a silent epidemic afflicted not only the flesh, but also the vital arteries of a state that naively believed itself eternal. The Antonine plague not only snatched countless subjects, but also stole the very soul of the ruling dynasty. In the early years of the epidemic's rampage, the imperial throne was shared by Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, both raised in the strict principles of Stoic virtue and the ideals of a wise philosopher-ruler. However, no philosophical treatises could prepare them for an encounter with an invisible enemy that relentlessly eroded the empire's strength without the aid of swords or legions. In 169 AD, Lucius Verus died, presumably a victim of the plague. Marcus Aurelius, shaken by the loss but not broken in spirit, continued to rule alone until 180 AD. His reign marked the twilight of the era of the 5 good emperors, becoming the last glimmer of its former glory. However, his death heralded a coming tragedy. He was succeeded by Commodus, his own son, a wayward and cruel youth, far removed from his father's philosophical ideals. The plague, which claimed the lives of millions of Roman citizens and soldiers, significantly weakened the system that had previously restrained tyrants. Commodus proved to be the complete opposite of a virtuous ruler. He imagined himself the reincarnation of Hercules, fought self-indulgently in the arena as a gladiator, traded state offices, giving them to the highest bidder, and surrounded himself with a crowd of flatterers and traitors. The collapse that followed Commodus's reign heralded the decline of the Western Roman Empire. His time in power was so destructive that many historians agree the epidemic merely exposed a gaping weakness, while Commodus himself completed the destruction. After his assassination in 192 AD, the Antonine dynasty ceased to exist, and the state plunged into civil war, military anarchy, and a prolonged decline that inexorably brought it to its demise. A tragic transition occurred from a golden age of wisdom, expansion, and order to a period of turmoil, intrigue, and destruction. In this grim atmosphere that enveloped the empire, an outstanding figure emerged, a witness, a scholar, and a survivor, Claudius Galen. A native of Pergamon, he was invited to Rome by emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus at the very moment when the deadly disease began to spread through the capital. Galen did not merely observe the unfolding catastrophe, but meticulously documented the manifestations of the ailment, detailing its symptoms: high fever, diarrhea, throat inflammation, and characteristic skin eruptions accompanied by pustules. His medical treatises, created during and after the epidemic, became one of the fundamental pillars of ancient medicine. Although his knowledge was limited by modern standards, Galen was the first to propose separating the sick from the healthy, and also recommended hand-washing, anticipating the concept of bacterial infection by many centuries. For many researchers of the past, Galen appears as the first physician in history to confront a pandemic that swept across vast territories and managed to approach the problem systematically. His scientific works left an indelible mark on the history of medicine. For over 1,000 years, his writings were meticulously studied in both Europe and Islamic countries. However, he also witnessed the confrontation between scientific knowledge and superstition in a society undergoing a profound crisis. While Galen meticulously analyzed the symptoms of the disease, a significant portion of Rome's population continued to believe that the plague was nothing more than a punishment sent by angry gods. Thus, amidst universal death, prayers, and medical treatises, Galen became the embodiment of scientific knowledge, confronting inevitable doom in an era when both reason and faith were severely tested. The Roman army, the pride of the most powerful civilization of the ancient world, found itself in a precarious balance against an invisible enemy. The Antonine plague spared no one, whether a common peasant or an experienced centurion. Legions returning from the eastern frontiers brought with them not only military trophies and glory, but also deadly contagion. When Emperor Lucius Verus died in 169 AD, many suspected poisoning, yet his illness symptoms were identical to those observed in his soldiers: high fever, skin rash, and rapid tissue decomposition. Marcus Aurelius, deeply shaken by the immense losses, was forced to make difficult decisions, contrary to accepted norms. He ordered the conscription of slaves, gladiators, and criminals into the army to somehow replenish the depleted ranks of the legions. The plague spared no one, mercilessly devastating military camps. According to some historians, the losses were so great that the Roman army was on the verge of complete disappearance, without losing a single battle. In the epicenter of this health catastrophe, the Marcomannic Wars unfolded, as a coalition of Germanic tribes, taking advantage of the Roman Empire's weakening, descended upon its Danubian frontiers. Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher endowed with a warrior spirit, was forced to postpone a counteroffensive for 3 long years, as a shortage of soldiers and general exhaustion hampered his actions. When he finally launched his counterattack, the emperor faced not only the onslaught of barbarian hordes, but also the heavy legacy of the plague, the vulnerability of an empire that naively believed itself impregnable. Many infected legionaries unwittingly became carriers of the disease, sowing its deadly seeds even among enemy tribes, thereby expanding the tragedy's borders. Rome's glory, once brilliant, began to rust to the accompaniment of a war it could no longer wage with its former confidence and might. And although Marcus Aurelius died on a military campaign in 180 AD, his reign is remembered as an era when the empire could never regain its former greatness. Steel proved powerless against the virus. The Antonine plague not only devastated the population, but also crippled the trade routes, vital arteries of the Roman world, which began to constrict. The Indian Ocean, once a bustling corridor for silk, spices, and precious stones, transformed into a shadowy passage. Historians, such as Raoul de Crespigny, suggest that the plague might have simultaneously afflicted the Han Empire in China between 151 and 185 AD. Such a coincidence seems too significant to ignore. It was precisely when Rome and China were strengthening diplomatic ties that this deadly disease emerged. In 166 AD, a Roman diplomatic mission reached the shores of the East. Did they carry a message of friendship or a deadly virus? The first signs of the terrible disease, which came to be known as the Antonine Plague, were recorded not in the heart of the Roman Empire, but in Smyrna, located in Asia Minor. However, the chronological proximity between the arrival of the mysterious mission and the outbreak of the lethal virus sparked a wave of suspicion among scholars studying the period. Rome, of course, did not completely cease its import of silk and exotic incense, but the volume of supplies diminished significantly. Merchants, gripped by fear of contagion, sought to avoid risks. The arrival of every foreign vessel in port caused widespread alarm and apprehension. Trade links weakened, which inevitably affected the overall state of the empire. After all, the Roman Empire was strong not only due to its invincible legions, but also its developed trade, bustling markets, and cosmopolitan atmosphere. The Silk Road, once a vital artery ensuring prosperity, became a bleeding wound. The Antonine plague dealt a devastating blow to global trade, like an eclipse obscuring the sunlight. And although Rome continued to procure goods from the east, its former grandeur gradually faded, much like the lights of a great city extinguishing one by one as night falls. With the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, not just the life of an outstanding individual came to an end, but an entire era. This philosopher, seated on the imperial throne, skillfully governed the state despite the raging plague epidemic. However, after his death, the reins of power passed to his son, Commodus, whose excessive ambition, cruelty, and megalomania caused serious alarm among the Roman elite. Commodus proved to be not merely an incompetent ruler. He became a veritable detonator, undermining the very foundations of the empire. While Rome desperately tried to heal the wounds inflicted by the plague, Emperor Commodus sank ever deeper into the world of bloody gladiatorial contests, proclaiming himself the new embodiment of the legendary Hercules. Wild beasts, mercilessly slaughtered for his amusement, became the arena for his madness, while the governance of the vast empire was entrusted to avaricious favorites steeped in corruption. During his reign, the grandeur of imperial power was diminished, its sacred aura vanishing. The Senate trembled in fear of him, while the common people seized every opportunity to ridicule him. Commodus was obsessed with the cult of personality, and his complete indifference to state affairs led to the empire losing its last vestiges of stability. In 192 AD, the emperor was assassinated within the walls of his own palace. His death came by strangulation, as if the empire itself had rejected its ruler. With Commodus's death, the Antonine dynasty, which had given Rome a succession of 5 outstanding emperors, came to an end. The ensuing civil war, in which generals waged a ruthless struggle for power, plunged the empire into chaos and paved the way for an era of fragmentation. The Antonine plague, Commodus's reign, and the subsequent instability were not random, isolated events. They were the first dominoes, setting off a chain reaction that ultimately led to what historians would later call the slow decline of Roman civilization. Rome still stood, but from within, it began to rapidly empty. In the epicenter of this chaos, amidst widespread fear and death, a solitary figure saw truth among the corpses. Galen, the celebrated physician of the Roman era, was summoned from Pergamon to the capital when the plague epidemic erupted. It was 168 AD, and the empire needed not only an army, but also knowledge capable of confronting the impending catastrophe. Galen appears before us not merely as a physician, but as an eminent thinker, a talented anatomist, and an indefatigable researcher. In an era when the plague sowed chaos, he displayed not flight, but astonishing courage, remaining to observe and record the symptoms of the disease. His records of fever, diarrhea, pharyngitis, and the characteristic pustules appearing on the 9th day, centuries later, would lead modern epidemiologists to suspect smallpox. However, Galen was unaware of the existence of bacteria and viruses. In his understanding, the world was determined by the will of the gods, the balance of bodily fluids, and, of course, personal courage. Remarkably, despite having no concept of pathogens, he implemented measures that would later save millions of lives. Isolation of the infected, adherence to hygiene, regular hand-washing, simple, yet revolutionary ideas for that era. It was an act of true wisdom, demonstrated amidst widespread ignorance. Galen's works, particularly Method of Medicine, served as a guide for Western medicine for over 1,000 years. It is no surprise that his name became synonymous with physician. Galen could not save the Roman Empire, but he left behind something more valuable: the first systematic attempt to understand the nature of the plague using rational research methods. In a world where enraged gods raged and dark omens prevailed, Galen became a voice of reason, resonating amidst the sinister echo of death. The epidemic, known as the Antonine Plague, did not merely affect the physical health of the Roman Empire's inhabitants. It undermined the very foundations of a statehood that was already losing its stability. Military units, having suffered significant losses, returned to their homelands with exhausted and terrified soldiers whose strength no longer allowed them to effectively defend the borders from external threats. Entire provinces, deprived of reliable protection, became easy prey for barbarian raids. However, it was not only military invasions that made Rome tremble. A sinister silence descended upon the squares. Markets suffered from acute shortages of goods, the countryside lacked laborers, and in once bustling urban quarters, only death cries echoed. The empire, accustomed to conquest through arms, found itself helpless in the face of an invisible enemy. Fear, like a virus, spread with incredible speed, infecting everything. Each family that lost a loved one drifted further from imperial ideals. The notion of Rome as the eternal center of the world developed its first crack, revealing a gaping void into which despair, superstitions, and premonitions of a new era seeped. Many researchers are inclined to consider the Antonine Plague as the starting point of the empire's decline. Not thunderous battles, but the quiet whisper of death penetrating through colonnades and temples became the harbinger of impending change. Marcus Aurelius, exhausted by illness and the burden of governing an empire slipping from his grasp, passed away. His son, Commodus, was destined to assume power over a state already in agony. The era of this emperor's reign became an embodiment of degradation, excessive spending, and loss of reason. However, perhaps his actions were merely a consequence of assuming power over an already doomed state. Rome, once considered eternal and invincible, had lost its grandeur. The plague epidemic not only claimed lives, but also undermined people's confidence in the future. And when confidence vanishes, empires crumble under its weight. Thus, a new world order began to form. In this world, faith replaced the ancient gods, and fragmented kingdoms sought to find their purpose in the encroaching darkness. The virus that afflicted Rome was not only biological but civilizational. And although the empire's complete fall took centuries, the Antonine Plague was at first irreparable crack dealt by the invisible hand of death.